we can see. Just like to give a quick idea of what we'll be covering today, hopefully nothing too much of a surprise. So we'd like to just run through the background and scope of the programme, the Climate Resilience and also the Strategic Priorities Fund, about the embedded researcher scheme, some background and scope of that. And Paul's going to give us a whistle-stop tour of his project and the embedded researcher scheme. And we'll talk a little bit about submission details and proposal requirements, and then open the floor for any questions. So please do use the question and answer function, which should be available to you through Zoom, to ask some questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. We can also do some offline if we don't get through or we don't have an immediate answer for you. So without any further ado, so the Strategic Priorities Fund, which is the overall fund which controls this, is an £830 million investment, and it's looking at multi and interdisciplinary research. It came about following Paul Nurse's review of a common fund, and it's really to drive high quality multi-interdisciplinary research which is linked effectively to government departments, and it can respond to strategic priorities and opportunities quickly. So the UK Climate Resilience Programme is an £18.7 million project funded under the Wave 1 of the Strategic Priorities Fund. It's a collaboration between UKRI and the Met Office. So NERC lead on behalf of UKRI, but we also have partners with EPSRC, ESRC and AHRC. And projects funding started in early 2019 and will continue to spring 2023. So the vision of the programme is to enhance the UK's resilience to climate variability change through frontier interdisciplinary research and innovation on climate risk, adaptation and services, working with stakeholders and end users to ensure that research is useful and usable. So hopefully that's a nice quick overview of where things are. The programme has three main themes. There's climate risks, climate adaptation and climate services. All the details can be found on the website, which is at this link. We will share these links afterwards, so you don't have to scribble down too quickly. But the website can be found under ukclimateresilience.org, so feel free to have a browse. So it's just a quick infographic about what some of those things might include. So climate risks, we're looking at heat, drought, storms, rainfall, and this is just not an exhaustive list, but it's a nice infographic, so I thought I'd share. So we're looking at climate adaptation, so it's resilience to flood defences or heat extremes or food supply. And then climate services, looking at a roadmap through and policy, and also looking at the resilience of the community and developing standards, guides and codes of practice and health. And these don't work in isolation or in silos. There are lots of projects and scopes under the programme which fall into a cross-cutting theme. So if I pass over to Kate now.
Hello, thank you, Simon. So I'm going to say something about the background and the possible scope of the embedded researcher role, and also a bit about why we wanted to include this scheme in the UK Climate Resilience Programme. So, So as Simon mentioned, I'm one of the two co-champions for the programme. And so as co-champions, we have a role in shaping the research calls, ensuring there's alignment across the research portfolio, building connections between the funded researchers and more widely, promoting knowledge exchange across the programme and with other relevant communities. And we particularly, given the focus of the strategic priority funding, making links to government priorities and to other user communities. So this slide is an adaptation of a slide that was developed to explain the different roles of knowledge involved in knowledge brokering. And I've adapted it for the programme. So the focus of the strategic priority funding is on research relevance and usability by the user communities. And it's so it's something that we've really been focusing on in the programme in a number of different ways. So in the way that we consulted in the development of the science plan, the criteria that we use for sort of monitoring and evaluation of the programme, the way that we run events, so webinars that we run on the funded research, we have both an academic and a user perspective on what's been achieved and the significance of it and why it's valuable. But it's also very much in the design, the way that we design the research calls, so having a requirement to engage with non-academic partners and to ensure that there is a sort of close relationship so that research outputs are likely to be usable and relevant. And the embedded researcher scheme is really quite a good example of this. So this slide just shows across a sort of spectrum from sort of linear dissemination of information to much more co-production, the different functions that can be involved. And so sort of from the informing end, it's very much about sort of sharing project findings in a report or academic paper. And then as you move across, it's more about sort of translation to more specific circumstances and linking across research disciplines, and then getting very much more into the application in specific contexts. And that's, I mean, the embedded researcher could play many of these different roles, but we're sort of imagining it's much more towards the sort of application end and the co-production end, and working with a host organisation to develop research of mutual interest. So it's kind of a mechanism for spanning the boundary between academia and practice. And so it's an opportunity to sort of understand the day-to-day context of an organisation and what the drivers and constraints are to decision-making within it. And hopefully by understanding that, to improve the potential for impact of the resulting work. And obviously COVID has had an influence on the current cohorts, so it affects the kind of literal sitting within an organisation and getting to sort of know the ways of working. And I think Paul may say something about this when he talks about his work. But maybe for the next cohort, hopefully, because it's not starting till November, this will be less of an influence. Next slide, please, Simon. Yeah, so there are many possible roles that an embedded researcher could play, and they could certainly play more than one. I just put a few examples up on here. So firstly, co-exploring existing knowledge, so not creating new knowledge, but sort of contextualizing it to support decision-making within the host organisation. It could be around co-producing new climate knowledge or new climate services on climate risk or adaptation and building climate resilience. It could be about creating or sustaining learning forums around climate adaptation and integrating climate information to that. So it could be about strengthening existing networks across public, private, civil society sectors and building a kind of culture of learning about how to adapt well within these networks. It could be about sharing lessons. Or it could be other things, and it could be one or more of these things. So those are just some examples. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this just is the current cohort. So we've funded in the first cohort 6 embedded researchers, and they started towards the end of last year, and some started in January this year. So we've got a researcher based at the University of Sheffield who's working with Anglian Water to understand how forecast capabilities can inform future operations within water systems and lead to better adaptation planning at a system level in the context of the changing climate and changing population and other drivers of change. The next one is Manchester. This is Paul, so we'll hear from him in a moment. He's based at Manchester Metropolitan University, and he's working with the Manchester Climate Change Agency and developing a policy and action planning framework to support climate adaptation and resilience building in Manchester. Then we've got a researcher who's based at Newcastle, who's working with the Environment Agency and working with their flood and drought incidents response team to understand the implications of climate change for their future capacity requirements. We have a researcher based at UCL who's working with the Department of Education and looking at their school building stock and thinking about heat stress and the implications of heat stress on that building stock. We have a researcher from the University of Manchester working with Bristol City Council in developing a heat vulnerability index and a heat resilience plan for Bristol. And finally, we've got a researcher based at King's College London who's working with Space for Climate and the London Climate Change Partnership. And she's creating climate stress testing tools to improve the UK's food security, and also working with the Earth observation industry and the UK food supply chain to bringing them in to do that work. So I'm happy to answer questions at the end, but I'm now going to pass over to Dr. Paul O'Hare, who's going to talk about his experience of being an embedded researcher within the programme.
That's great. Thanks very much, Kate. Could somebody make me host, please, so that I'll hopefully be able to share my screen? Thank you, Simon. Brilliant. And Simon, can you see my my slides? Brilliant. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me along to talk about what I'm doing as part of the first cohort in the Embedded Researcher Scheme. So I'm Dr. Paul O'Hare. I'm a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm embedded with the Manchester Climate Change Agency. And a little bit of context about what the agency wants to achieve through the Embedded Researcher Scheme. That's recognised that there's been quite a significant amount of work done in the city to develop a policy framework and to develop aims and objectives and a series of metrics to encourage businesses and partners right across the city to engage with climate change mitigation. But there's also equally recognised that adaptation has lagged quite a bit far behind in this regard. And that's not to say that that mitigation or that adaptation is any more important than mitigation. And in many respects, I'll be the first person to say, well, we need to really try to crack on with mitigation. Mitigation is absolutely vital, but there's a recognition that adaptation is increasingly urgent. However, the city hasn't paid just so much attention to adaptation. So although adaptation is mentioned in the city's climate framework, it doesn't really have any stringent objectives, and it certainly doesn't have an indicator set or a metric framework around which action can be coordinated. So these were the broad objectives in quite straightforward language in the bullet points on this slide. And one of the first things that I've done for the city is to begin to think about how we can assess the city's vulnerability and to establish a framework for assessing the city's vulnerability, which hadn't actually been done in any comprehensive fashion up until now. If you want to find out a little bit more about my work, you can have a look at my Google Scholar profile and get in contact with me either via email or via Twitter. I've written quite widely on resilience and adaptation, but I was increasingly aware that as academics we very often speak to each other in this kind of academic echo chamber, where we engage, we think about concepts such as resilience and climate change adaptation, but it's very, very difficult to translate our thoughts and our conceptual developments into something that really has an impact on policy and practice. And I suppose I was beginning to feel that I increasingly did have something that in my own small way I would be able to contribute to the city's struggle to deal with climate change and to wider societies adjustments to climate change. So I entered the partnership genuinely, in the spirit of wanting to develop a two-way knowledge exchange whereby I might be able to provide my expertise on climate change adaptation, and that I would also be able to learn about how policy development takes place. I did have some previous experience in this regard because I was a number of years ago during my PhD, I was a successful candidate for the ESRC Parliamentary Secondment Scheme as well. So I had a fair idea about what an embedded researcher's work might entail. The distinction with this scheme was that it was very much based on my research interest, and in many regards the Climate Change Agency, what they wanted just happened to fit really quite nicely around the experience that I felt that I had. And as I think the scheme might be slightly different this year, but it did seem to be quite driven by the policy needs of the host institution last year. But I know the team will say a bit more about that, and I'm sure there will be some questions about that as well. And of course, it would be remiss of me to say, one of the other attractions of the scheme, and it'd be surprising if this wasn't a driver, is the drive that we have from a career perspective and from an institution perspective around income generation, and all of the career development benefits that brings. That was certainly a factor as well, if I was just to be completely honest about it. But it was really driven from a real desire on my part to try to get the stuff that I'd been writing in papers that had been generated, if I was lucky, a handful of citations, but to really take that work and try to translate it into something that would have practical and policy relevance for the city that I work in and spend so much time in. So in terms of developing the bid, and just to flag up, I do think that UKRI will say a bit more about this, but there was already some limited interaction between Manchester Metropolitan University and the Manchester Climate Change Agency. So the university was actually a member of the Manchester Climate Change Partnership, which is affiliated to the agency, and the agency itself was beginning to think about the establishment of an adaptation resilience advisory group, or what was to later become an adaptation resilience advisory group, because I think the staff at the agency recognised that there was expertise in the institutions in Manchester that could be tapped into. So although I hadn't worked with the Climate Change Agency before in any great way, I was aware of their work, and they might have been aware, perhaps not of my work, but certainly of some of my colleagues' work at Manchester Metropolitan University. So after the first call came round, Manchester Climate Change Agency ran a recruitment process, a competitive recruitment process. I applied for that and successfully went through to the second round. And it was that point then myself and the interim director of the Climate Change Agency worked quite closely together to build up a much more detailed bid. And really, it was a bit of a matchmaking process, really, where I discuss with them what they wanted and what they believed that they required in the realm of climate change resilience and adaptation. I told them what I could do, and also probably quite importantly told them what I wasn't comfortable doing, what I wouldn't be able to do, because I think it's really about trying to find a really nice fit between the host institution and the embedded researcher, and then beyond that, trying to assess what might be feasible within the timescale and the funding that was available. And that's really what that set the parameters around which then we developed the work packages, the objectives, and the methodology for the work. So a few reflections so far. I've really enjoyed it. I'm a great advocate. I think it's a brilliant scheme, really good scheme to get academics into the real world, or the relative real world of policy making. These things are always very relative, and really quite have enjoyed engaging on a daily basis with the Climate Change Agency. And my time is I've got 80% of my time with the agency, so I do spend quite a bit of time on the agency's work. There have been challenges, though. Resilience and adaptation is, I would say, again, quite rightly, perhaps, sometimes in the shadow of mitigation, and encouraging people to think about resilience and adaptation, and to put that onto people's horizons, even within leading partners across the city. That has been a bit of a challenge, and required a little bit of work on my part. One of the things I've really struggled with is thinking about how we might set an objective and an aim around resilience and adaptation for the city, and beyond that then how we can establish a metrics and a monitoring system for that. It's also been quite challenging to look for opportunities across other agendas. So in terms of climate change mitigation, there are some really exciting initiatives going on in the city. So it's been challenging, but also quite nice to get involved in some of them to see if I can push forward resilience and adaptation agendas, even trying to get some of the words into various policy frameworks. This has been written about and talked about in many academic papers, but the policy world really is very different from the world of academia. It's, in some regards, it's much more fast-paced, but in other regards, I think there does seem to be, certainly in the work that I've been doing, there does seem to be less interest necessarily in originality, which drives a lot of academic work. And that's not to say that originality isn't important, but a much more fundamental driver is this notion of what matters is what works. So part of the role that I've had is to reach out to other climate change agencies across the UK and to look at the work of other climate change agencies globally, and to identify what seems to be really good ideas there, to see if then we can take that back to the UK and take it back into Manchester and give it a Mancunian spin in order to achieve the objectives of the Manchester Climate Change Agency. Deliverables have been quite interesting as well, because the deliverables as we presented them in the and will be presenting them back to UKRI, sometimes they don't work very well for the world of policy and practice. So I've had to play about with just what deliverables cover, and really hopefully not to get too hung up about it, but there's been a little bit of bolting together aspects of deliverables so that they make a bit more sense whenever they go on to the Manchester Climate Change Agency's website, and whenever I talk to the partnership and to the Manchester Climate Change Board about that. COVID has, on the one hand, been a big challenge. I quite like, I do come from a bit of an ethnographic background, so I do quite like the face-to-face interaction that you get in an office. But obviously, I haven't been in the office ever, actually, whenever it comes to the Manchester Climate Change Agency, and doesn't look like we'll be in anytime soon. It has to be said. But we have missed that face-to-face interaction, those kind of serendipitous run-ins that you might have on a corridor or in a lift, where you can talk about ideas and so on. Everything's very much done online. Equally, to be honest, that I think has made people much more accessible. I have met with loads of different people who it might be more difficult to meet with if I was traipsing across the city, or they were traipsing across the city to me. And of course, there is also the time-saving dimensions. I calculate I save probably about 80 minutes a day that I don't have to travel into the city. I'd like to say all of that was dedicated towards work and self-improving activities, but sometimes it's just been translated into spent a bit more time walking the dog in the morning. So he hasn't been complaining too much about that. There can be challenges with managing relations with the home institution, working out, just how much time needs to be spent back at the university. I've been very lucky. MMU have been very supportive of all of this, but sometimes even if only 20% of my time is spent doing teaching and administration, in some weeks that can actually be quite difficult to fit into my climate change agency work. And other challenges, you kind of, in an embedded researcher scheme, I think you inherit some of the challenges that the host institution has as well. So there have been pretty substantial staffing changes at the host institution. So we're as of next month, we will actually we won't have a permanent director at the Climate Change Agency. So that brings some added constraints and challenges into the mix as well. And just really to round up, Kate asked me if I had some top tips about people are thinking about applying for the scheme. I think the first one is really to find out really the needs of the placement, the needs of the host institution, and begin to identify where your skills might fit, and not to perhaps overpromise to the host institution, because if they ask you to do something that is beyond your capabilities, then I don't think that that's necessarily good really for anybody involved. So I think it's really about trying to persuade the prospective host to have a think about the work that you've already done, and how that might be of use to their mission, to the work that they're engaged with. So I think it's really about having a very open two-way dialogue about that, and really being quite honest about what you may not be comfortable with, and what you might try to kind of steer away from, because it isn't necessarily within your area of expertise. The Climate Change Agency basically integrated me into their weekly meetings and so on, really from the outset. So my funding started in January of this year, but I was aware that I'd been successful in the project from about September, and they brought me in, and I made it along to as many of those meetings as I could. So that was really nice, because I feel whenever I started in January, I already felt like I was part of the team. And I almost put this in the final tip as beware of mission creep, but actually I changed it to be aware of mission creep, whereby in an agency such as the Manchester Climate Change Agency, lots of different things can come across your desk, not necessarily initially quite obviously related to the core of my project, which is about resilience and adaptation, but I've got involved in them anyway, both because it's good perhaps to have somebody representing the agency in various meetings, but also because it has been given me, for example, I've been involved in some of the mitigation work, which is an area I don't know a great deal about, but it's given me a real insight into the policy development process. And I'm thinking about, well, maybe in 6 or 7 months' time, I will be at a similar stage with the adaptation work, and how can I perhaps have a think about how we can progress policy making by looking at other aspects of the work of the Climate Change Agency. So that's it from me, Simon. So very happy to take any questions that people might have.
If we could, sorry, Paul, if you could just make me host again. I think I gave it all the power to you. If we just save some questions to the end, that'd be great.
There you go, Simon. That should be you now.
Thanks, Paul. So hopefully everyone should be able to see my next slide. So thank you, Paul. I thought it was a really, really useful overview and some great lessons, and to learn what's going on and some of the challenges faced. And yeah, as you mentioned, there's a couple of differences to the scheme this year, so hopefully we'll get into those details. I just want to quickly talk about eligibility and what the requirements of the embedded researcher scheme is at the moment. So any area related to UK climate resilience and adaptation in the UK is eligible. We are encouraging this around environmental, social and governance areas, tourism, insurance and finance sectors. Those have been identified as areas that we don't have as much coverage across the programme. However, everything else is eligible, and those will not necessarily be the areas funded, and we will look at the scores, and at the excellence of the proposal submitted will be the deciding factor. Host organisations can only be involved in one application. Same goes for individual researchers can only be involved in one application submissions, and the individuals, aka researchers, have to be from an eligible organisation which UKRI can fund. The list of those are on the UKRI website, but if you want to discuss any eligibility questions, please do get in contact with the Climate Resilience mailbox, which you would have contacted to get access to this webinar, and we can help you out with that. So, as Paul noted, one of the changes to the scheme this year is it's not a two-stage process, it's a single-stage process. So researchers and hosts will submit one joint bid of one project at the same time. This is an attempt to, on one hand, streamline the process for everybody, but also to ensure that there's co-production of ideas. So researchers and hosts can co-develop ideas, either using existing networks and collaborations. As Paul said, there are already connections between MMU and the Manchester Climate Change Agency. But we also recognise that a risk in doing it this way is that people don't have links. So we're proposing that host organisations who want to pitch ideas can send those to the champion team. So the details are up there by the 28th of May. And they should include details about what their interest is, their motivation for the scheme, and what kind of activity they envisage doing, and a person to contact. So they will be published on the UK Climate Resilience website, and people who are interested are able to contact those host organisations and discuss a fit and go through those criteria, which Paul really eloquently explained earlier. So the deadline for that is 28th of May, so that's just under a month away now. Into the nitty gritty of the UKRI submission stuff, even though the call and the funding opportunity is live now, Jez for submitting the document will not be open until the 12th of May. Closing date will be the 22nd of July. So hopefully that gives people a little bit of time to start making connections if they don't already have them now, and developing proposals. We're looking to fund a minimum of 3 embedded researchers this round. It's not many, I'm afraid, but unfortunately we're restricted by budget of what's left in the programme, but we're really looking forward to running this year. The total budget allowable is the 100% cost is 84,000, so NERC will pay up to 70,000 of that. Project should only last up to a year. The length, duration, timeline, schedule, days a week, those kind of details, they should all be appropriate to the opportunity and the project, but they should be negotiated between the host and the individual, and anything that's submitted will be considered. We're looking to hold an assessment panel in September, with a notification as soon as we can after that for projects to begin from the 1st of November. Unfortunately, that's a purely financial restriction in terms of getting money out when we need to get money out from UKRI, but the start dates of the projects could be beyond that, as Paul has indicated with his example. So I will just say thank you now for joining us, and for Kate and Paul and Joe. Just to reiterate, this webinar will be available online afterwards. There are further details about the scheme can be found online. And also, if you want to register for the Climate Resilience newsletter, which is monthly, I believe, Kate, which is quarterly, there we go. There's so much information in the last one. It was a bumper packed edition. You can do so by contacting the champions, and it's essentially everything that's going on in the programme at the moment, which is quite a lot, and it includes opportunities for engagement. I can see, and also we have some details which you may want to connect to, so how to find us on Twitter, YouTube and online, and also who you might want to contact to discuss issues. Thanks everyone. I will leave the floor open to questions. I think Joe has kindly agreed to be our MC for the day, so if you'd like to, and please feel free to type away as we're talking. I'll give you the opportunity to ask some questions. So, oh, I can see quite a few in there, so I'll let Joe crack on, and myself, Kate and Paul will try to answer to the best of our ability.
Okay, yes, yes, thank you. Yes, please keep adding your questions to the Q&A, and if someone's posted a similar question to yours, you can upvote other people's questions. So I'll start with a couple of more practical questions that I think have been covered in the presentations, but just in case you want to add anything more on these. So we had a question asking, will the project be predefined by host organisations as last year? So
the answer is broadly no. So it should be a co-delivery and a co-collaboration between the host and the research organisation. However, the host can submit, potential host can submit ideas and topics which they would like to start projects on, and some potential researchers can apply to help answer those questions. Kate, do you have anything else to add?
No, I suppose, I mean, the original idea of the scheme was that it was the initial kind of pitch comes from the host organisation. So I suppose that sort of ethos, I'm quite interested in trying to keep that as much as possible, rather than it being a push from the researcher. So yeah, just to bear that in mind, really.
Okay, thank you. And a related question, and you mentioned collaborations and networking. Do host institutions and organisations have to communicate to their chosen researcher? And I think that's largely been covered, but it is open to existing collaborations, I believe.
Yep, so existing collaborations that are already there, and I think that's clearly a strength, as Paul gave the example of, between this organisation and the host. But we're also open to making new collaborations, because that's one of the benefits of this scheme, is creating new partnerships and brokering new knowledge exchange. So it goes both ways.
Okay, thank you. And a question about the application success rate. So we had 6 successful applications in the last round. So the question is asking how many applications did we receive in total?
Joe, I'm gonna throw that back to you. I believe there were 26, somewhere in that region.
It wasn't quite that many. It was okay. 20 in total, 20 applications we received.
Okay. Yeah, so this time round, I mean, it's the difficult balance in this scheme is we'd like to attract as many great applications as possible, but we only have a finite budget. So that's the reason we've restricted eligibility to 1 per host and 1 per researcher, is to manage that work and that expectation, and also given that we can only fund a minimum of 3 depending on budgets. We'd look to do more if things are under budget, but that's where we're aiming at the moment. So that's the reason there is a restriction on capacity for submission, just for the time and effort for researchers and hosts manage that.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just trying to group the questions together at the moment, and I'll sort of include these 2 questions together. Firstly, is there any movement on the 1 application per host organisation? Some host organisations are very large and have broad remits. So my concern is this may be very restrictive in some cases. And also a question about whether the research pitch should come from the host or the researcher.
So the answer to the first question is no, unfortunately. We will be looking for the organisations to have to prioritise the areas they think are going to be best suited to the project. So at the pitching stage, you can submit up to 2, but in the full submission stage, we would like a submission of only 1. Sorry, Joe, what was the second part of the question?
Whether the researcher or the host organisation should submit the research pitch.
So the research pitch should be from the host organisation, but the full submission through JES to UKRI will need to come in from the researcher. It needs to come in via the academic route.
Thank you. I'll look at some questions now on the sort of research topics and themes. This question is asking, saying, I noted understanding the risks such as flooding and adaptation for topics, for example, resilient sea defences and services. Would resilient and adaptive communities be part of this call? For example, social ecological systems and cultures?
Shall I answer that one? Yeah. So yes, I mean, if you have a look at our website, you can see there's quite a lot of the arts and humanities funded research, which is very much about communities and living with uncertainty, and there's other work around co-developing sustainable urban drainage systems. So communities, that community level is, climate and communities is definitely something that we would be interested in getting good from.
Okay, thank you. And a question about a sort of appreciation, acknowledgement of scholar activist approaches and partnerships, such as participatory action research. Past partnerships seem all to be more with more formal institutions in the embedded researcher scheme, but I would be keen to be embedded with more grassroots organisations if possible.
I'm a big fan of participatory action research type approaches, and we already have a project, the MOCA project in the now, which has become the MAGIC project. They're using participatory action research processes in that, so it's definitely something we can consider.
Yes, definitely, that would be one that's completely able to be considered. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And how do climate change threats to biodiversity and habitat conservation fit within the aims of the programme and the call?
We already have in the funded research things around sort of peatland quality, that, you know, that's very much, there's no barrier to that kind of work. That's, yeah, it's so long as it's around resilience to changing climate, then it's within the call, I'd say, within scope.
Thank you. And the next question, should the researchers applying already be employed at the research institution before they become embedded with a host organisation?
Thanks, because that's an interesting question. So you should, if not already employed by the research organisation, you should have an agreement for contracts through the life of the opportunity, so up to 12 months, and so your contract should outlast the length of the project in your research organisation. So we'd envision you are employed by the time the project begins.
Okay, thank you. And can a researcher be embedded with the host organisation on a part-time basis, as is appropriate to the scope and aims of their proposal?
Yes, so I'll let Kate jump in, but yes, as is appropriate to the project and agreed between the two parties.
Yeah, I mean, Paul mentioned he was 80%, but we'll have another embedded researcher who's, I think, 50%. So yeah, it's definitely possible.
Thank you. To what extent does the seniority of the researcher in the application? Would early career researchers have a chance with this scheme, or are you able to assess experience in established researchers?
I don't know if that was just me, but Joe's audio was went then, so I think it was just a question around what extent does the seniority of the researcher matter, and can early career researchers have a good chance? The answer is yes. We're not restrictive on this scheme. It's just the applicability of and the fit of the researcher to the project and the idea and the scope. If the researcher doesn't have JES validation in terms of submission, they can submit through a dummy PI from a UKRI perspective, but that's it needs to be clear in the application who if the researcher is, if they're the junior person. But yeah, Kate, I think we'd very much advocate for all levels.
Absolutely, yeah.
So just covering this question, I think we touched on this already. Is the funding expected to cover postdoctoral salary or further activities associated with the proposal? As I understand it, existing people already in post, and the host organisation cannot claim funding.
Sorry, Joe, I completely missed that. I think your audio is gone. So it was a question around the salary, or if you're able to tell me who asked the question, I will find it on the list.
I think it's a top question.
Top question. Okay, yes. So the budget is for salary, but also for the other everything else that is required within the project, whether that's TNS, although I guess in the first tranche there's been less travel, but yes, and any overheads that the research organisation requires. And that should be fully justified within the application. But yes, you're correct in saying, I believe, that the host organisation can seek no direct funds from this project. UKRI.
Thank you. We had a question about the status of data and intellectual property generated under the scheme.
So that's a question of the status of the data and IP generated under the scheme. So I would say, from a UKRI perspective, we require a data management plan if there is anything submitted successful through, which will work with the UKRI data centres, and that requires some open access to that data. You obviously need agreement and understanding with your host organisation, because there may be some specific data policies that they have. Kate, do you have any
oh, sorry, thoughts? I missed that. I was trying to answer another question.
Sorry, just on data and IP. So we have an open access data policy, but obviously that needs to be agreed with the host organisations, that anything can be shared, or what level can be shared at.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose part of, this isn't a consultancy, so we want to be learning partly about this, so yeah, that has to be agreed. But yeah, we don't want to it's not doing consultancy, that's kind of, so some of the information has to be made available and so that other people can learn from it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really big output of the scheme as well.
Okay, thank you. And we've had a question asking for information that researchers can submit only one proposal for this fund, and whether it excludes other UKRI funds such as the SRC. Although I should point out this is a cross-council programme.
Yeah, so just it might just be my ears, but just to read the question again for those who couldn't hear Joe, it's to confirm that researchers can only submit one proposal for the fund. Yes, that's correct for this specific call. My reading of this question is they're asking, does it exclude other UKRI funds? So can you submit to another research council for another opportunity? Yes, you can. So you can submit whatever your eligibility is across the UKRI, but for this specific embedded researcher scheme, you can only submit one application, and it wouldn't have no further bearing on any restrictions that your organisation might have in submitting to other schemes across UKRI.
Can you hear me okay?
Not really, Joe. So I might start reading the questions if that's okay. It sounds like you might be underwater somewhere with some electrical interference. Can the organisation be a professional body? I would say yes. We're open to all sorts of host organisations. I don't think we're restricting that, as long as it's an opportunity appropriate to and fits the scheme. I saw Kate nod, so hopefully that's she's going to confirm that that's the case from her perspective as well. Next question I see is, if the individual researcher is on a fixed term contract, but their contract be paused to enable them to participate, so if they're funded from UKRI, so usually, well, I think I answered some of this earlier, so we'd need agreement, whether that be a letter from the head of department that the contract, so their contract within their academic organisation would be able to continue past the end date of their project, whether that means they are in effect pausing to go and do their embedded research project, or to do it part-time, so to elongate their initial project. But if there are any specific questions around that, please do get in touch and we can talk you through that policy. This might be one for Kate. Do we have any, well, I think Paul's given us a good overview of a case study of a successful embedded researcher. And I think I could probably just point you towards the website as to where things are in terms of other projects. A lot of things are just kicked off in 2020, so through the summer and autumn. So we're at an early-ish stage with some of the projects. But I'll throw that ball to Kate.
Well, I mean, as I understand it, it was quite a new scheme for UKRI, wasn't it? I don't think it's sort of similar to some of the other schemes, but it was slightly different. And I mean, I've seen it used as a project called Fractal in South Africa, and that's where I got the idea for it, really, the embedded researcher scheme there in the water industry, working with local government, so embedding researchers in local government around thinking about water resource management. So there's quite a lot of quite nice material through the Fractal project that's I find quite interesting, talking about the role and what people who played that role learned from doing it. So it's obviously quite a different context, but there's some quite nice information there. But this cohort, Paul's cohort, is really the first embedded researcher cohort, I think, for UKRI.
Cool, thanks. Do organisations have to pitch an idea, i.e. can a submission be made without going through the pitch stage? Yes, a submission can be made without going through the pitch stage if the organisation and the researcher have collaborated in doing so. However, we may encourage people to pitch if they don't have a definite researcher in post. It gives us a good opportunity for people to apply for opportunities and to host to find the best possible researcher. However, it's not a requirement that you have to submit a pitch in able to submit an application. It's a way of bringing people together and maximising that opportunity. Someone's asked about a number of days which people may be expected to be within the host organisation. That is completely up to the opportunity. So as we say in the initial round, the first round of embedded researchers, which is currently ongoing, I think that's the split between, I think there's 50 to 100% somewhere across that spectrum. There is no minimum requirement, but it should be suitable enough to deliver the objectives of the project. The maximum length will be across 12 months. The project can be shorter than that if required. However, due to the quirk in the UKRI spending or funding, the funds will be profiled across 12 months, but the project could be less than that. Yes, it's essentially what is appropriate to the project and what's agreed between the host and the researcher. Nothing off the table. Clarification around contracts needing to outlast the embedded researcher project. Yes, they do for UKRI funding. I'm afraid you need to be employed or agreement for employment beyond the length of the project. That's a tips for Joe's mic, so I won't answer that one. Likely costs for a host organisation. We see those as anything, I suppose, within a mixed model of in-person and non-person attendance, that those costs may vary, but they will include sort of any training or desk space and access to systems and computers, that kind of thing. But I wonder if I'd just open up to Paul and Kate in case you have any further thoughts about what they might be.
No, as far as I'm aware, there were none for my host organisation. In fact, I know that there weren't any for the host organisation.
not aware of any.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so as long as we'd expect relevant training and access to systems and IT systems to be taken in by the host organisations, but no further costs.
Time in kind perhaps would be the only one. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've got once I have an organisation that's ready to host, but I think this is saying, does this mean that if there is a pitch submitted with a researcher preliminarily attached, could the host change that researcher if another one comes in and applies for that or contacts the host organisation? In theory, the host could favour one researcher over another, but I would imagine if you've co-developed the opportunity together that wouldn't be the case. I would hope that'd be the case. I mean, that's a quirk within the system that might happen, but if something has been co-developed and delivered, that shouldn't be the case. The pitching is really for people who don't have a solid connection already or researcher. And just to follow up to that, how do I initiate the process of being connected to a host? So you could either go and seek one yourself if you're a researcher, or you could have a look at the submitted pitches and see what best suits you, and get in contact with one of those hosts to try to tailor one of those opportunities, or to just off your own back go and find those opportunities. Unfortunately, we can't match make for you, because that becomes a bit tricky for us and tricky for you, but we can give this opportunity for you to try and find some appropriate links. Thank you. And this question is, who would the researcher be employed by? So the researcher should be employed by their academic organisation throughout this time, and so essentially they should continue to be employed by their academic organisation. They've noted there may be issues with access to data sets and various things in host organisations. We'd expect an agreement to be in place between the host and the researcher to be able to access anything they need to do to be able to complete the project. Yes, they need to be employed by the academic organisation throughout, I'm afraid. It's a little bit too tricky for everyone involved if employment starts changing for short term. I think that is all of the questions raised so far. Hopefully that's well, answered your questions, for want of a better phrase. If you do have any further questions, please do contact either the Climate Resilience mailbox, which Joe and I manage, or the champions for Kate, and we will do our best to answer your questions. But I will, on behalf of my other panelists, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you in the future. Thank you very much.